So in your chapter, you talk about three versions, and there's the Maximal Doctrine, the Minimal Doctrine, and then the Parsimonious, which is I would say like a subset. I think maybe you said a variation of the Minimal Doctrine.
Yeah.
Is that the right characterization, or am I missing a third one there?
No. I think you've got it right. I mean, I think I was just trying to give a sense that the view that I'm trying to articulate falls somewhere in between these sort of two poles, if you like, and try and give a kind of framework for readers to see that there are different options, really. I mean, I think sometimes when one reads the literature on divine simplicity, one gets the impression that there is this monolithic thing called the doctrine of divine simplicity that until recently everybody agreed to and assented to, and then it's been criticized in recent times. But actually, as is often the case with these sorts of complicated academic questions, things are rather more complicated than that. And in the history of Christian theology, there's lots of different sort of iterations of the doctrine of divine simplicity, some stronger than others, some weaker than others. And of course, there has been criticism of the doctrine, particularly in recent times, but much of that's not that new. There's been criticism of it in the past. But there are particular ways in which the doctrine is being discussed today that make it a hot topic and an interesting prospect for theologians who want to cut their teeth on some particular thorny theological issue.
Yeah. So can you help us with, maybe we could start with like the Maximal Doctrine. Like what is the Maximal Doctrine of divine simplicity?
So I'm thinking the Maximal Doctrine is one which has the following constituents: that God's simple in a very strong sense. He is simple in this sense, not simple as in foolish or stupid, but simple in the sense that there's no complexity in his being, right? So you can't subtract anything from God. God has and is what he is essentially. That is to say, he can't gain or lose parts. Not only that, but the Maximal Doctrine says that, in particular, when we think about the divine nature, who God is or what God is, and we look at the divine attributes, things like his being all powerful, all knowing, all seeing, eternal, all those sorts of things, that though they seem like distinct things that we can predicate of God, it turns out that in reality, those things are not distinct with respect to the divine nature. In other words, his divine attributes imply one another, to use a kind of technical term, but more than that, they imply the divine nature. So there's no real distinction in God between the divine attributes that he has and between those attributes in his nature, in a way that there is with respect to creatures like you and I, right? So, for example, you might say, well, my friend Jones has a certain mass, is a certain height, has a certain hair color. There are lots of things lots of attributes of Jones that you could use to describe Jones. Some of them will be essential to Jones. If Jones loses those things, then Jones will cease to be Jones, like being human, for example. Other things Jones could lose and still remain Jones. So presumably if Jones had all her hair cut off, she'd still be Jones. Even if she has some terrible accident with a piece of farming machinery and lost an arm, she would still be Jones, just a mutilated Jones.
Yeah.
But the point is that her attributes are distinct from one another, and they're distinct from Jones herself. We can predicate certain things of Jones, but we understand that they're distinct from Jones. The point with the Maximal Doctrine of divine simplicity is that sort of distinction that we use all the time when we're talking about mundane things just breaks down when it comes to God. God is so wholly different from everything that he's created. And his nature is so different from everything that he's created. It's just not the case that God has distinct divine attributes in himself, or that those divine attributes are distinct from his nature, if we can speak of a nature of God. Now, of course, God appears to have distinctive divine attributes to us, but that's just because of our finitude and the fact that we're finite, limited creatures, let's say. And it's also because we've got a limited vantage. In other words, we can only see certain things about God at any given time. So here's an analogy. Suppose you go to see Michelangelo's David in Florence, which is a wonderful and magnificent statue. And you look at it from one vantage. Well, you can only see one aspect of the statue from that particular vantage. You have to walk around the statue to see all the different aspects of the statue. In a sense, that's a bit like us with respect to God. We see certain things about God from the vantage that we have, but there are other things we don't see. With respect to God himself, those things are not different, but they're one. in God himself. That's the claim.
Yeah.
So he's simple in a very strong sense, that he doesn't, strictly speaking, have distinct attributes, and his attributes, strictly speaking, are not distinct from God's self. So when we say he's simple, and we mean by that he's without parts, he doesn't have any parts whatsoever, it has in this strong doctrine this very important connotation that there are no real distinctions in God aside from the members of the Trinity.
Yeah. Okay. And I've heard of, I mean, it's kind of cliche by now, but often people will talk about a light in a prism, right? So like white light, and it contains all these colors inside of it, but it's not until it hits the prism that you see the full rainbow on display. And maybe, creation is the prism and God's the white light. And it's
Right.
kind of an analogy for,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, these are all, of course, they're only analogies, and we're
Right.
trying the best we can to apprehend something that's mysterious. And there's lots about the doctrine of divine simplicity, this kind of high octane version of the doctrine that's sort of counterintuitive. But defenders of that version of the doctrine will say, of course, it's going to be counterintuitive because we're dealing with an entity, if we can talk about God as an entity, that is not a creature.
Mhm.
There's a massive ontological gulf between God and everything that was created, and we can't bridge that gulf. So inevitably, our grip on the divine nature is going to be at the very least, at the very most rather, partial and piecemeal.
Mhm.
And it would be surprising that when we're dealing with something as fundamental as God himself, our grasp of these things is going to fall short in some important respects.
Yeah. Yeah. And that totally makes sense. And that transcendence, something we'll get into, which you talk about a lot in your Trinitarian
Right.
Mysterianism.
Right.
So how might the minimalist or minimal doctrine of the Trinity differ than that maximal? Is the maximal what people call the austere simplicity? Is that the same thing?
It might be, depending on what you mean by austere, but I certainly think that the maximal doctrine is the sort of doctrine that you'll find in historic defenders of divine simplicity, like, for example, Thomas Aquinas.
Okay.
I mean, Thomas Aquinas is often pointed out as being the great medieval theologian that he was, that he's the kind of high watermark of a lot of these sorts of discussions, historically speaking. And so that's the sort of view you'll find in Thomas Aquinas. Now, the minimal doctrine is sort of at the other end of the spectrum, and the minimalist wants to say, well, when we say God is simple, what we really mean is not that he's without any parts whatsoever, but rather that he's strongly unified in some sense. There's something about his divine nature that means we can't chop him up into smaller parts. That much is true.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't mean that he's got no parts whatsoever. That's too strong a claim. So we want to say something weaker than that, something that allows us to predicate different things of God, and that doesn't have the consequence that in predicating those things of God, we're committed to saying that those things don't exist as different things in God, so to speak.
Yeah.
So it's trying to create some space between the claim that God is unified in this very strong sense. God is one, if you like. Hear, O Israel, the Lord, our God, the Lord is one, is the great the Shema in the Old Testament. Is wanting to say that on the one hand, but without some of the apparently counterintuitive consequences of the kind of strong doctrine of divine simplicity that ends up with this notion that there aren't any distinct divine attributes in God, and there's no distinction between the attributes and the divine nature.
Yeah. Okay. So would a minimal doctrine say something like God has parts, but they're inseparable parts?
You might say something like that, yeah. You might say that God's strongly unified, that kind of language.
Mm-hmm.
But the distinctions that we see in God are not distinctions that can be hived off. So you might still be committed to something like the claim that the attributes that God has are essential to who God is. You couldn't remove those without ceasing to have God.
Yeah.
But they are nevertheless distinct attributes in God, something like that.
Okay. And I could see someone saying, well, what the great writers of the Confessions and Aquinas, what they were getting at was something that can be picked out by the minimal doctrine, and really, they didn't mean something like the strong maximal doctrine. In your lights here, did they know what they were talking about? They knew that they wanted the maximal view, or is there ambiguity there that we can debate that?
Well, as I said earlier, I don't think there's a single historical
Right.
doctrine of divine simplicity.
Yeah.
So I think there are sort of variations on a theme, if you like,
Mm.
and some are stronger than others. And as I said earlier, Thomas Aquinas is often thought of as the higher watermark because he has, this strong doctrine that commits him to the various sorts of aspects of the sort of stronger doctrine that I outlined. But there are some other theologians who seem to me to be committed to a fairly strong doctrine of divine simplicity, but it's not necessarily identical to the view that Thomas Aquinas has. For example, someone like Anselm of Canterbury, a few centuries earlier than Thomas Aquinas, who says a lot about divine simplicity, but it's largely a kind of what we might call an apophatic account of divine simplicity. In other words, rather than saying what God is, you approach God by saying what he's not.
Yeah.
God is without composition,
Mm-hmm.
something like that, rather than saying exactly what that lack of composition, turns out to be.
Yeah.
So I do think that there are variations on a theme, but I do also think that for many of the historic sort of Christian theologians of the tradition, they're sort of clustering around views, are clustering around a sort of set of ideas that most of them will take to be ideas that are not negotiable. Let's say, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that that's now not the case, and theologians regularly attack divine simplicity or distance themselves from divine simplicity or even deny divine simplicity, is something that is, I think, a noteworthy development in the Christian tradition in the modern period.
Yeah. Okay. So just going back again to Aquinas, he's the high watermark. So Anselm is more apophatic. Is it right to say that Aquinas did cataphatic theology when he's talking about? He's actually presenting this is what simplicity is rather than apophatic?
I think, yes, in some respects. I mean, of course, Aquinas has a fairly high tolerance for apophatic or negative theology as well. Negative theology here just meaning we approach God by saying what he's not rather than what he is. That God is not limited. God does not have a body, those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. So that there's that strand in Thomas Aquinas as well, because he's influenced by the tradition of so-called negative or apophatic theology, particularly people like Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. But he's also willing to make certain sorts of qualified and careful cataphatic claims. In other words, positive claims about who God is. God is this. God is like this. But one must also bear in mind that for Aquinas, all our language about God is analogous. In other words, there's ways in which it's similar to the thing that we're describing with respect to God, but there's ways in which God is different from it. So for any attribute that applies to God on Thomas's view, there's going to be ways in which it's similar to our mundane sense of that term. Jones is powerful, God is powerful. Well, there's a sense in which where Jones is some kind of creature. There's a sense in which there's commonality between those two ascriptions of power in Jones and God, respectively. But there's going to be important senses for Thomas in which there's going to be difference between those two ascriptions as well. Of course, Jones may be powerful to the extent that maybe Jones is a world champion weightlifter or something like that. But the power that Jones has is going to be, in significant respects, very different from the kind of power that we ascribe to God. So one always has to bear in mind that when Thomas is making certain claims that look like he's making substantive and positive claims about who God is or what God is, that he's also couching that in this broader idea of religious language where he's, as it were, guarding against what he sees as the mistake of thinking that we can speak univocally about God. In other words, say that, when we talk about power in Jones and power in God, we just talk about exactly the same thing. It's just that God has got more of it than Jones had.
Right.
And for Aquinas, that's going to be a mistaken way of thinking about the divine nature. And the reason for that is just that he has this this sense that there's this massive ontological gulf between God and his creatures, which is another very traditional sort of a claim. You find that in Aquinas, you find that in Anselm, you find that in many of these classical theologians who proceed on the assumption that whatever they say about God, they're talking about something which is utterly unlike everything that's created.
Right.